Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. If you were ever worried about the Buffalo Bills season being canceled, if you just can't get enough of a good, well-fought contact sport, then stay tuned. Not because we have football on the agenda, but because we have Western New York's second roughest contact sport about to begin. Politics. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of year. Take off the gloves, let the games begin. Well, in all seriousness, on this big picture, we're going to back off a little bit about the bare knuckles part of it. And we'll start with a more, shall we say, tame discussion with one of the players, Nate McMurry. He's no stranger to the political game here in Western New York, and he's now running for the 27th Congressional District. And as a Democrat on the ballot, well, he's going to explain what it's like to be a Democrat in today's world and why you might want to vote for him. And Nate, let's get right into the conversation. The first thing I want to touch on, just because of what we've been going through recently, is the disturbances that have happened locally and in Minnesota. And just there was a bad cop. I don't know whether he was dumb or whether he was a bully or both, but he set off some pretty difficult circumstances. What's your take on what's been happening, you know, nationally for the last few days?
Well, I wake up every morning and there's an emptiness in my stomach. I mean, it's a terrible time for our country. We have 40 million people out of work. We have a virus that's killed over 100,000 people. And now we have our country literally burning. There was fires in front of the White House last night. And no one can be proud of violence. I am not going to support violence on any side. I think it's wrong, and what's happening in that regard is absolutely wrong. But we clearly have a problem in our country with inequality that we have failed to address. Now, we've had progress. It's gotten better. But if you look at the statistics, and I'm someone who believes in statistics, the plight of African Americans in our country is unequal and unfair. And we have failed to address it as a society. And the most glaring example of that is what you see is police brutality. And you can't ignore the numerous cases that have gone on over and over and over again. And of course, we have to respect our law enforcement. But we have a problem. And we have to take that problem seriously, just like we would take any other problem seriously, just like our scientists are attacking this virus seriously. We have to look at this problem and figure out effective ways to address it. If we ignore it, we're going to repeat history. We're going to have another situation 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now when this dies down, and we'll be back at it again, asking ourselves, how did we get here? So I believe it's a sad moment for America, but it's a sobering moment, and our only way to address it is to look at it objectively and say, how can we fix this?
Every walk of life has a variety of people, good, bad, doing their jobs. Do you think that law enforcement in general is now, and this has been a word that's been used repeatedly on national media, do you think law enforcement is systematically racist? Is that fair to put that on police officers? Or do you think that this is a case of, like I just said, individuals that are bad that just happen to be employed as police officers instead of any other occupation?
Well, Phil, the question is, if it's just a few individuals, do we have a system that's allowing those individuals repeatedly to become police officers? Now, I was a small town supervisor, and I was a commissioner of police, and I dealt with the police, our police on Grand Island, who are great people. It's a very different situation, and a lot of times Grand Island is an idyllic place. And I know how good they are, and a lot of those officers served in other towns. They served in Niagara Falls, they served in the city of Buffalo. These are good men. So when you say there's a systematic problem, it doesn't mean that all of our police officers are tainted by the stain of racism or bigotry. But we obviously have a problem in our country where we repeatedly have these incidences over and over again. I know I'm someone who's lucky enough to have traveled a lot overseas for business. and also for school. And you deal with police officers in other countries like the UK, and it's not as militarized or hostile as you have the situation you have in the United States right now. I think we have to look at it and say, how can we improve? How can we look at the best practices of other places and figure out a way to make our communities safe and protected and served, but not feel like they're a threat or constantly being discriminated against. So I do believe we have systematic problems across our country that have created an atmosphere where many people in our country do not feel protected by the police. They feel assaulted by the police, or they feel the police is a threat to them. And I think none of us want that situation. And if you talk, we would not have this widespread violence if we did not have a systematic problem. This is not just an overreaction. It's symptomatic of a society that has failed to address this issue for a long time by simply writing it off as a few bad apples. We have to figure out how those few bad apples continue to be employed over and over again across different communities in our country, because the incidents of violence are too frequent.
Well, that's a good point you make. And the incidents of violence, if you say on the one side that there's all too many police officers that are caught abusing their power, and that's on one side. And then there are protests which are peaceful, and then there is violent protests and riots, if you will, that react. Isn't it a matter of overreaction versus overreaction? In other words, the peaceful protesters get lost in the shuffle. They're not going to be remembered in the past few days because of all the violence that's taken effect. And
100%.
isn't that the sad part? I mean, the violence is not really, I don't think that that's outrage from the police officer. I think that that's a whole separate issue of young men, primarily, who get the word that they can go out and have fun by destroying things and maybe get free stuff by breaking into stores and various other things. And I don't think it has anything to do with the people who are genuinely outraged at the behavior of the police officer. Those people have a genuine concern, and they protest just like Martin Luther King advocated, peacefully and to get their message across.
Phil, you're right. I'm never going to advocate for violence. I'm a Christian, and Christ was the ultimate pacifist, right? Turn the other cheek. And I'm also a believer. I was impressed by the people like Martin Luther King and people like Mahatma Gandhi, who confronted serious difficulties, serious violence, and still they endured in a peaceful manner. And I think it helped change our society. Martin Luther King, we celebrate him because he was a transformative figure in our society. And that's the most difficult way to change the world. But I believe in the words of Martin Luther King, who said, love begets love, violence begets violence.
Let's move on to the race that you're going to be in, that you are in, the 27th Congressional District. And you are going to be running against Chris Jacobs right now. There will be other people running against Chris in the primary, but he's got the endorsement right now. Now, you're the Democrat in the race, he's the Republican in the race. There are a lot of common questions that are asked. I want to ask a very basic question that I don't think gets covered all that much, and I want your take on it. What is the difference in today's world between someone such as yourself, who is a Democrat, and someone who is a Republican? Philosophically, how does a voter decide who to identify with? What's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican today?
Well, I'm a Democrat because I believe in that we need to protect working people, and the working people need a voice in the society. I'm a Democrat in the way that Bobby Kennedy was a Democrat. I believe that inequality and poverty is a real issue that we have to fight for. I grew up in North Tonawanda. I was one of 7. My father died when I was 4. And my mother raised us by herself. I know what it's like to struggle. I started off at community college. I worked my way up. I went to law school. I became a Fulbright scholar. I learned multiple languages. My background is very different than Chris Jacobs' background, who was born into great wealth. And I understand what the people I grew up around live like. I understand what people across NY27 live like and how they struggle. And I believe your Social Security should be protected. I believe that people have a right to health care and people have a right to a life. And I think that there's nobody fighting. I don't take corporate money, any corporate money. All our money comes grassroots. That's it, unions and grassroots. And the reason why is I believe when I go to Washington, I want to be the voice of the regular people, not the voice of the corporations. And if you look at the policies of the Trump administration, he's had massive opportunities to do good things, the things he promised. He promised healthcare for every single American. He promised it. He promised infrastructure. And in 3 years, when he had the support of the House, he had the support of the Senate, he had the support of the courts, all of those were Republican dominated at one point. But right now the House is Democrat, but for most of his administration, he had all three. And all he's given us is tax cuts for people like Chris Jacobs. Tax cuts to support the most wealthy Americans. That is what their agenda is. Now, I believe in business. I was employed by Chris Jacobs' family. I don't know if you know that. I was a vice president of business development for their own company. Now, I'm someone who has worked in business across the world and across the country on development projects. I understand business. I understand the importance of the bottom line. But I'm also understand the importance that people do not want to live paycheck to paycheck, and that someone has to fight for people in this country so that they do have livable wages, they do have health care, that their Social Security is not taken advantage of. Don't forget, not too long ago, the idea of privatizing Social Security was coming into play. Can you imagine what would have happened if we had privatized Social Security with this crisis? How many people would be struggling right now? So in essence, I believe the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party that I want to fight for, and I can't talk about every single person in the party, I talk about my values, is the party of people like my father, people like my friends and family who were union people who worked hard, people who demanded accountability. I don't know what the Republican Party stands for today. I don't. It seems if you look at the commercials for Stephen Mahailu and Beth Parlato and Chris Jacobs, all they want to say is how much they love Donald Trump. I'm not going to Washington to serve Donald Trump or to serve Nancy Pelosi or anybody else. I'm going to serve the people of NY27. And if you look at it, I think today the Republican Party is the party of Trump. It's whatever he says it is. The ideology changes by the day. One day he's against trade, then he's for trade. One day, you can't keep track of it. One day he's saying the virus is the worst thing ever. The next day he says go to work. And they'll follow whatever he says. If you watch Fox News, it's incredible to me. They'll literally change on day to day based on what Trump is advocating for. So I think the better question is what does the Republican Party of today stand for? I know what I stand for personally, and I will fight for the interests of people here, the type of people that are in my family, the type of people I grew up with, the type of people I care about. I have no idea what they're advocating for. I really don't, because the party's values have changed so much.
Okay.
Like when I grew up, let me say one more thing, Phil. When I grew up, I looked up to a lot of Republican leaders. A lot of us looked up to Ronald Reagan. That was my generation. That's the president I grew up under. I don't agree with everything he stood for, but he was someone who represented a lot of a hopefulness that America needed. Or even people like William F. Buckley. I read all of his books as a kid. I read them all because I liked the type of, there was things about him that I could admire. And the fact that he was advocating for a more sophisticated America, more intelligent America. I don't know what Donald Trump represents, and I don't know what the current Republican Party represents. But I think we need a restoration of a strong Republican Party and a strong Democratic Party, because right now it's a lot of mush.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, we're out of time for this segment. I want to get into that, how politics work, and what would happen if you're elected and in the Trump administration. We'll get into all of that. Stay tuned, because this is going to be interesting. When we come back, we'll be right back after this.